People have been calling me Bob Jr., so I figured I better take some leave for those council meetings if I'm going to be Bob Jr.
Good evening.
Who's going to beatbox? Who's going to beatbox?
Testing.
Bueller.
Testing. Can you hear out there? Larry, can you hear this?
Yeah, this one. Bueller.
Testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Michael.
1, 2,
Michael.
3.
Okay. Testing. 1, 2, 3. That's better. I can hear it. Good evening. It is 5:30, so we're going to call this special work session to order. Remind you to turn your cell phones to silent, and then let's stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Amanda, would you take the roll?
Councilmember Rowe.
Here.
Councilmember Stevens.
Here.
Councilmember Strebe.
Here.
Councilmember Dalby.
Here.
Councilmember Myers.
Here.
Mayor Lazio.
Here. Needed a motion for the approval of tonight's agenda.
So moved. Second.
Councilmember Rowe.
Yes.
Councilmember Stevens.
Me?
Approval of the agenda.
Yes.
Councilmember Strebe?
Yes.
Councilmember Dalby?
Yes.
Councilmember Myers?
Yes. If the council would indulge, I'd like to reverse the order of the presentations tonight. Let's do item number 2 first and get that taken care of, and then we'll get into our presentation. Is there anyone in the audience that wants to address the council tonight? Okay. So Amanda, let's start with resolution 142.
Resolution number 142, 2017, setting the date for a public hearing on the intent to dispose of city-owned property located at 413 North Pocahontas. Recommendation, pass and adopt resolution number 142, 2017.
Move the recommendation as presented.
I'll move that also. I'll second it.
Thank you, Bob. Any questions? Okay, take the roll.
Councilmember Rowe?
Yes.
Councilmember Stevens?
Yes.
Councilmember Strebe?
Yes.
Councilmember Dalby?
Yes.
Councilmember Myers?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, tonight's special session is really intended to give us some information, and we have Mr. Brian Bakey from HDR engineering firm, and Brian's been actively involved with our staff doing a facilities plan review, and so without any further ado, I'd like to ask Brian to step up to the microphone and walk us through his report. And after he gets finished with his report, we'll open it to general questions. So good evening, Brian, and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, very good. So I was here several months ago to discuss the same topic and the need for a facility planning effort for the City of Ottumwa Water Pollution Control Facility. We have been working on that effort here for the last few months in various stages. And tonight I'm here to present to you probably the part of it that you're most interested in, which is the capacity evaluation for the wastewater treatment plant. And talk to you about how we developed that capacity assessment and the difference between where you're currently rated for capacity by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources and what we feel you could potentially expand capacity and get a higher rating through the IDNR. Go ahead. So tonight we have an outline that just kind of provides you a brief plant overview. Some of this I presented to you previously, so I'll go through it relatively quickly. We'll review current capacity, current flows and loads, current performance of the plant, capacity determination, which is the meat of what we're here to talk about tonight, and then some potential uses of that capacity and the next steps that we need to think about. Keep going. You know, I'm a wastewater guy. I've done this for 17 years, so a lot of this comes second nature to me, but I realize that you probably don't delve into wastewater treatment all that often. And so I wanted to just briefly talk about some terms before I go on a rant and get you all lost right away. So when we talk about MGD, that's flow in millions of gallons per day. Pounds per day is basically a mass loading. We talk a lot about pounds per day in a variety of different contexts, but you will see that throughout my presentation. Milligrams per liter is a concentration. Your effluent limits are in milligrams per liter. Biological oxygen demand or biochemical oxygen demand, or BOD, is basically the organic strength of a wastewater. TSS, or total suspended solids, are the particulates that are in your wastewater, and those are two of your effluent limits, BOD and TSS. And then TKN is total killed-all nitrogen, or that's the organic nitrogen plus ammonia. So if you see those throughout, you'll at least have some reference of what those are. The goals of wastewater treatment are, to remove organics, to remove debris, potentially remove pathogens from the receiving stream. Okay, and these are the various different processes that are used. And we also treat the solids that are generated at the plant, and we'll talk more about that. But this is pretty much background. The plant process flow diagram for the Ottumwa Water Pollution Control Facility is shown here. Flow comes into the plants from the left. There's a 44 million gallon EQ basin that stores peak wet weather flows. During dry weather, normal flow goes through a screening process, grit removal, primary clarifiers, which we'll talk about in more detail later on in the presentation. And then primary clarifier effluent, or the discharge from the primary clarifiers, goes through what are called vertical loop reactors, which perform the major biological treatment at the facility, reducing BOD and total suspended solids, and ammonia before discharge to the river. In those vertical loop reactors, basically we grow bacteria, we grow bugs, right? We use the organics that are in the wastewater. They eat it. They use air in the water through aeration. They like to stay aerobic, and that provides them a mechanism for growth. And then we remove those bacteria and that biomass through what are called final clarifiers, where we settle it out, and some of it's returned back to the aeration basin to do more treatment. Other parts of it are wasted out and digested before land application. Downstream of the final clarifiers, you have UV disinfection, which removes pathogens before discharge to the Des Moines River. As part of primary clarification, we generate primary solids, which are digested and stabilized in the anaerobic digesters. You'll see those in the lower right-hand corner there before land application as well. And so there's two forms of solids generated at the plant, aerobic solids and primary solids. And both of them are digested in different ways, but both are ultimately land applied on agricultural farm ground. Go ahead. Just an overview of the plant. If you haven't visited before, you can see the various unit processes. You know, the facility, actually the 44 million gallon EQ basin is up in the upper left-hand corner there. Flow enters the headworks, then to the primary clarifiers. And you can kind of see how the plant's laid out. Go ahead. I don't want to recreate the wheel here. Capacity and current flows and loads. So the current rated capacity for the plant is an average flow of 6 MGD, a million gallons per day. Average wet weather is 10. Peak instantaneous flow or maximum day flow that they can actually hydraulically get through the plant is 12. The design BOD load is 11,600 pounds per day, and we'll talk more about that number later. That's the number we're trying to verify and see if there's an ability to achieve a higher rating than that 11,600. The design TKN load is 2250 approximately. So the first part of our facility planning process is to gather a bunch of data. You know, we gather 3 years worth of plant operating data, influent flows, influent organic strength, concentrations, performance of each individual unit process. We try to characterize how the plant is performing throughout a 3-year period. That gives us plenty of data set to look at peak flows and peak concentrations and peak loads and how the plant responded during those conditions. So this is peak flow, and this is BOD loading in pounds per day. So pounds per day is on the y-axis on the left, and you can see the rating was about 11,600. And so the plant, all the red dots are daily values. Those have stayed mostly below the 11,600, but there's been a few daily maxes, which is fine. What we're mostly worried about is the 30-day average, which is the black trend line. And you can see that that peaked out at about 8,000 pounds per day in April of 2015. It's the long-term averages that we are mostly worried about at wastewater treatment plants because that's the most critical condition for performance. For total suspended solids, it's a little different. We see these typically low loads below 10,000 pounds per day, but then we get these intermittent spikes occasionally up to 20,000 pounds per day. And the reason for this is, you know, you're all aware that Ottumwa's got combined sewers and has impacts due to wet weather and precipitation and high river stage. And typically when those high flows come, it carries a bunch of solids with it. And those solids go straight to the treatment plant. And so those are those large peaks that you see in this graph is due to the peak wet weather contribution of wet weather flows. TKN has averaged about 1,000 pounds per day with peaks up to 14. So here's your characterization of your flows and loads summary. The maximum month BOD is about 9,400 as compared to the 11,600 that you're rated for. You can see that there's a large difference between the average annual TSS of 6,900 pounds and 22,500 pounds. That's a big difference. That's a big peaking factor, and that's due to the wet weather. And so this becomes the basis for comparing, you know, kind of where you're rated at, where you're operating, and how the plant's performing. And here's a comparison to capacity. Go ahead. One of the things we needed to consider in our evaluation was that over the last several years, the city has tried to get Dr. Pepper Snapple Group to implement a pretreatment program that would reduce loadings to the treatment plant, to the city's treatment plant. And that was finally implemented in April of 2016. So previous to those times, the BOD loadings reflected no pretreatment by Dr. Pepper Snapple Group. And after that was the flows and loads with Dr. Pepper Snapple Group. And so you can see that the trend line is slightly downward, and there are indications that that is improving plant performance and making additional capacity available to the city. Just real briefly, oh, where did my, go ahead. Nope, keep going. That's okay. As far as the capacity calculation is developed, and I'm going to talk about current performance as we go through this section. But the first thing we need to look at when we look at any capacity of a wastewater plant is what are the goals for treatment. And the goals for treatment for a wastewater plant are the NPDES discharge permit that's discharged to the city of Ottumwa. And those are the limits that the permit or that the plant has to achieve 365 days a year. Every month, Cam writes a report. He has to document whether or not he met permit that month. And but those limits are very critical to determining the capacity. And so we'll talk about that. The next is a review of each unit process. So not only do we look at the plant as a whole and how it's performing, but how did the primary clarifiers perform during that 3-year period? And how did the VLRs perform? And how did the final clarifiers perform? And how do they all relate together? How does one impact the other? Okay, and then we develop a plant process model. We take models that engineers have developed to look at wastewater treatment plants and their performance. We calibrate that model to the way that the Ottumwa plant has operated, and then we extrapolate how it might react during higher loadings. And these are very common process models. We use them every day to help plants with operations, to do capacity assessments, to size new facilities. They've become standard of the industry. And then once we develop that model, we can identify the limiting unit process and the available capacity or the potential rated capacity of the plant. And if there are simple fixes and bottlenecks, we can recommend remedies to unlock, capacity that may be realized through simple fixes and operational changes. And that's one of the things we'll talk about tonight. Go ahead. So here's your current permit limit. I wish I had a pointer, but basically the top line is the BOD effluent requirement. The 30-day average value for that is 25 milligrams per liter. It's a very typical permit limit for BOD here in Iowa. The same is true for the total suspended solids. They have the plant has a 7-day average of 45 and a 30-day average of 30 milligrams per liter. Again, very typical. There's a pH requirement, and then there's no toxicity limits. That's what the acute toxicity, those 2 lines there about halfway down the table. And that tells us that, and then there's an E. coli limit, which is requires you to do disinfection. But the toxicity limit is really what drives your requirement for an ammonia limit. So I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but if you had a toxicity limit, that would drive you into having to do ammonia removal through nitrification, which is a higher level of treatment for your discharge permit. But that limit doesn't exist in your permit today. All you're required to do is BOD and TSS and disinfection, okay? No ammonia removal. That's pretty critical. Go ahead. Primary clarifier performance has been pretty typical throughout the data set that we analyzed. If you look at about right in the middle of the chart there, it says annual average removal for BOD and TSS, 31% removal of BOD, 65% removal of TSS. Those are good numbers compared to typicals, which we see out of textbooks and we see at other plants. So you're getting good removals out of your primary clarifiers, and that's cheap treatment. You're not putting any energy, you're not expending any energy to get those removals. You're basically just allowing the wastewater to settle and then the solids are removed and digested, and it's a very economical form of treatment. The graphs there show the red is the incoming, the green is the outgoing out of the primary clarifiers for BOD, and so the difference between the two solid lines there is the amount that you removed. And you can see that the amount that you remove is actually getting bigger as you move into time, as you move to the right. And that's because Dr. Pepper Snapple Group is doing a better job of pre-treatment, and you're getting better removals in your primary clarifiers, which again is a benefit to the city and frees up some capacity there. The solids removal is shown on the next graph to the right. And so you saw those peaks in the red lines that we showed you before on the influent flows and loads. The green line is the effluent of the primary clarifiers, and they're very steady, and so, those clarifiers act as kind of a big white spot and takes out a lot of the outliers, the big peaks that they get from the wet weather, and creates a very stable operation downstream for the VLR. Here's the plant performance for effluent, BOD, and just total suspended solids. If you remember, our effluent limits were 25 for BOD, which is in red, and 30 for TSS, which is in green. And really, that's a 30-day average value. So if you look, you really don't want to look at each individual day, but those trend lines in the black there, and you can see that the plant's BOD has been at single digits, 0 to 5 milligrams per liter throughout the 3-year data set, which is phenomenal and really, really good performance. The TSS is a little more varied, but still very within reason and as well within the permit limit. And so the plant is operating very well. It's achieving a high quality effluent and is meeting its discharge permits pretty reliably. Let's go on to the next one. The last slide I want to show you here on the plant performance is the ammonia removal. Currently, the plant is operating in a nitrification mode, so it is removing ammonia from the wastewater. You can see that the influent TKN or influent nitrogen is shown in the red dots with the black line along the top, and then the green line, which you can't really see any difference of it. That's because it's been less than 1 milligram per liter for 3 years straight. Every time he's measured it, it's been rock solid. Awesome performance on ammonia removal. But if you remember, the one thing that I talked about in the permit limits is there wasn't a permit limit for ammonia. And so the plant is performing and achieving a level of performance that it's not necessarily required to do by the state of Iowa. That's the easiest way to put it. The plant is operated well. It's not harming the plant to operate in this mode. It's not harming effluent quality. In fact, you're doing downstream residents of Iowa a favor by removing ammonia. So that's great. Okay. So we take all this in. We take in the performance of the clarifiers, the performance of the VLR system, the ammonia removal that you're currently achieving, and we take all the other plant data that the plant collects, and we do a capacity evaluation. And the way that we have looked at this is we start with looking at the activated sludge capacity, or the VLR capacity. What's the capacity of the vertical loop reactor system to treat the flows and loads that come to it? And there's two major modes of operation that we looked at for determining the capacity. One is with the current operation with the nitrification and the ammonia removal that the plant has performed since 1997, because that's what they're used to, that's what they've done, and the plant operates well that way. And so we ran a capacity assessment in its current mode. The second mode is without nitrification, so not removing ammonia and basically looking at capacity that way. This is allowable by your NPDES permit. And so that's why we chose to look at it. If you chose not to operate it in a nitrification mode, you'd still be meeting your NPDES permit. You wouldn't be violating your permit at all, but it does allow some additional capacity. Then once we have the capacity of the VLR system, we look at that impact on the downstream processes, the digestion processes, to make sure they have the capacity to handle the increased loads that we're forecasting. And then we looked at primary clarifier removals to back into a headworks or influent loading. Go ahead. So why is with nitrification and without nitrification important? Well, they are fundamentally different modes of operation. First of all, this plot shows you effluent ammonia on the right, on the vertical axis, versus solids retention time in days along the bottom. Now, solids retention time is a somewhat complicated thought, but if you think about a cell of biomass, you grow a bacteria, it's basically the average time that each cell that you grow stays in the aeration basin. Okay, so within the aeration basin, that sludge, those bugs, that biomass has an age. And it's usually between 2 and 16 days or 20 days or 30 days, depending on what you're required to do with your permit. Okay, so the effluent ammonia is governed by the ability to grow nitrifiers that remove ammonia, and they grow slow. And they need at least 8 to 10 days of age before they actually do what they are intended to do, which is remove ammonia. And so if you don't have a sludge age that's at least 8 to 10 days, you're not going to grow those bacteria and remove ammonia. And so that 10-day limit that's shown on the right, that's where you have stable nitrification. That's where you have stable ammonia removal. The curve shows you that the performance as you transition from nitrification to not having nitrification. And this is a very unstable mode. We don't like to see plants operating in a partial nitrification mode. It creates a sludge that's difficult to settle. It creates trouble with the blowers and the controls. There's just a lot of issues operating in the middle zone here where you see the slope. Below 4 days, 3 days, you are preventing those nitrifying bacteria from growing because you have such a young sludge, and that's where you just do BOD removal and you don't do nitrification. And that's another stable mode of operation, but you're not nitrifying at that point. Okay? So SRT is one control factor that we have to think about, and it has large implications on capacity. And the reason it does is because of downstream processes that are pretty interlocked with the activated sludge system, with the VLR system, and those are the final clarifiers. Okay? We can't settle. We need to take the biomass that's grown, and we need to settle it out before we discharge to the river. Well, the clarifiers have a certain area, 14,000 square feet, and the DNR has standards as to how many pounds of bugs you can send to a clarifier based on the area that you have. And so that results in a limit of 30 pounds per square foot per day at design flows and mixed liquor concentrations, mixed liquor being the concentrations of the biomass that are in the activated sludge system. Well, we can use that limit to back calculate into a sludge concentration, a mixed liquor concentration of 2,780 pounds. And so we need to limit our design rating to that concentration of bugs in the basin, in the VLRs. Okay? And then we use our process models to develop a rating curve. And so along the y-axis, running up and down on the left-hand side, is allowable BOD loadings to the VLR system. And along the bottom is the sludge age in days. And remember, we want to be above 12 or below 4. And so we can use this rating curve to determine capacity to the VLRs because there's a constant relationship between the loading and the SRT and the sludge age and the effluent ammonia. So again, here's that graph of stable operation. And so if we're going to be in a nitrifying mode, we take the 12 days, we go up to the graph, and then we go over to the left, and we can see that that's a capacity to the VLR of 5,000 pounds, okay, 5,180 pounds. So this is kind of like a capacity curve, but we're only going to look at it at 2 different conditions, one with nitrification and one without. This is the one with nitrification, okay, 5,000 pounds per day of BOD. At that condition, we are running at a 2,780 milligram per liter mixed liquor. We have, and this is basically just a summary of what the plant would operate like at that mode. we're generating about 2/3 of the way down. It says waste activated sludge and total suspended solids. We're generating about 3,500 pounds of waste solids out of the system to maintain that 12-day sludge age and so forth. So that's about what I wanted to hit there. Without nitrification, we can reduce the sludge age to 2.5 days. Okay, that gives us a little leeway before we start getting into that dangerous zone. And if we take that 2.5 days at the bottom and we go up to the curve and then we go over to the left, we can see that the allowable loading to the VLR system is 18,600 pounds per day. So that's 3 times higher than the previous scenario with nitrification, because before, if you remember, we were at the 12 days, we went up to the blue curve and we went over to the left and we were at 5,000 pounds. So there's a 3-to-1 factor on the allowable loading to the VLR, whether you're in the nitrification mode or the non-nitrification mode. Now, before I go on, I'm probably boring you all to death. Are there any questions so far?
The air conditioning is keeping us awake.
What's that?
The air conditioning is keeping us awake.
Okay.
I have one, but it may not be relevant yet to what you've said, but it intrigues me about the nitrification.
Sure.
Because I think for years, when water was tested 2 miles upriver and then 2 miles below river, it was tested very similarly.
Right.
Okay, so when it was tested 2 miles up, was the nitrification any part of that test?
Well, if you're measuring flow in the river, you wouldn't see a difference between upstream and downstream necessarily if you were nitrifying and you were removing ammonia in your discharge, because the only ammonia you'd be adding is from your effluent, right? Yeah. And so that would be typical. If you saw a big bump from upstream to downstream in ammonia concentration, that would be probably due to the fact that you're discharging ammonia. But even if you guys were not nitrifying, the amount of ammonia you're adding isn't really significant compared to the entire flow of the Des Moines River. It's pretty insignificant.
And I may be jumping the gun on this just a little bit. So, but is there any environmental impact on not doing a nitrification versus doing the nitrification?
So that's a great question. And the reason, and so most plants have an ammonia limit. Most plants are required to do nitrification. And the reason they're required to do that and remove ammonia is because ammonia is toxic to fish and wildlife. Okay. And so there's a toxicity calculation that is performed to determine what level of ammonia removal you need to perform. In the case of Ottumwa, you guys have a river diffuser, which combines with JBS, and it basically acts as a mixer to get you the best mixing out in the river as you can. It basically is a very efficient mixing. What that does is it eliminates the toxicity of the ammonia in the river and allows you to discharge a higher ammonia value than typical plants are able to do. So basically, to answer your question, because of the diffuser that you have, there isn't a measurable environmental benefit of nitrifying for Ottumwa.
Thank you.
That was my question. And you answered another question, but you said you can reduce nitrification and have this sort of 3-to-1 ratio. How is that done? Like you said, with bugs, is that done with microorganisms, or how is that achieved? It's
basically achieved on an operational change to how the plant is operated. So when the plant staff operate the VLR system, they control the amount of bugs that they remove from the system every day. And so that controls the age of the bugs in the system, because if you remove more bugs, they can't stay in the system much as long, and so their sludge age goes down and it diminishes. If you don't waste as many out, the sludge age gets older. They stay in the system older. So you're always growing bugs, but you don't, the amount that you waste out of the system really controls how long they stay in the system and how long their sludge age is.
Okay, thank you. And back to Mark's question. So other areas of the state where there's not a mixer like there is in this region, they have toxicity limits that mean that they have to remove the ammonia in some way?
Yep. I would say that the majority of plants across Iowa, unless they discharge to an extremely large receiving stream like the Mississippi River or the Missouri River, most of them have an ammonia limit that requires them to nitrify.
Thanks.
Quick question here. Thank you for all your work, by the way. This is pretty educational for people that don't hang around this type of thing every day. Real quick question though, and it was kind of what Councilmember Strebe talked about there. What I heard you say was our permit does not require us to nitrify, right?
That's correct.
And is that because the Iowa DNR knows our situation? Because you say there are limits, in fact, to releasing ammonia because it can be harmful.
That's correct. So the way that the DNR calculates that is they do a mixing zone evaluation out in the Des Moines River, and they give you credit for a certain percentage of the river flow that's mixing with the effluent from the city's treatment plant. And they do a lot of statistical analysis because that analysis is performed on the extreme low flow in the Des Moines River and the maximum flow of the city of Ottumwa. However, most cities discharge on the side of the bank and just let it fall into the river, and then the plume kind of gradually expands. Well, that mixing zone doesn't get very wide very fast, and it's that zone of influence where the toxicity limits are occurring. Because of the diffuser, it spreads that whole discharge zone out across the entire width of the river, and now your zone of mixing and your dilution factors are much higher, which eliminate the requirement for nitrification and an ammonia limit.
Thank you.
The diffuser is a great tool and a great benefit because it's and a lot of plants do look at them, but not every plant will see the benefit that you do because of the receiving stream that they're on. You really need a large receiving stream with a lot of flow to take advantage of it.
But that's the benefit of being connected with the JBS too.
Mm-hmm. It's a benefit to them as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
So
we could have more capacity right now if we operated differently.
You're jumping the gun, Mayor, but yes, that's the takeaway of the whole thing is you could have a lot more capacity today if the plant staff, and the city agreed that we would just not remove ammonia and chose to operate the plant in a different way.
What's the cost relationship too if we don't remove the ammonia? I assume there's some savings there.
That's correct, and the biggest savings are on the air requirement, the power requirement for the aeration blowers, because the other aspect of ammonia removal is it takes a lot more oxygen to convert the ammonia to nitrate, as opposed to just removing the organics. And so you will save on a pound of BOD basis, you'll save quite a bit of power costs at the plant by only operating without nitrification. The downside to operating in this mode is you generate a lot more waste solids. Kind of the older the sludge gets, the older the bugs get, the slower they grow, right? Babies and young people grow a lot faster, right? Sure. And so, than older people. And so it's similar with the bugs. And so the younger you keep them, the more you produce. And so there's some additional costs in operating that mode in the disposal of the sludge that's produced. And so we haven't done that comparison, but usually power costs are up to 50% of the overall operating budget of the plant. Land application is far less than that. So we wouldn't anticipate that that benefit would outweigh the additional cost.
Despite the fact that the state doesn't require nitrification for this area, are there any ecological implications of having more ammonia in the river in this area or other regions around here? The one thing that's being talked about a lot currently is the sensitivity of mussels to ammonia. But again, and that fact is driving some ammonia limits at other plants lower.
But again, I don't think that even because of the dilution that you get in the mixing that you get from the diffuser, I don't think even with the reduced ammonia standards that it's going to have an impact on those very sensitive ecological creatures.
Or soil or river, or, everything has a health, a river health, and
Sure.
the lands around here. And so that's sort of where I'm going with that.
Yeah, and
question.
I think there are future things that we need to look at as far as nutrient removal, because ammonia removal isn't the only goal of wastewater treatment, and there's future impending total nitrogen and total phosphorus removal goals that the state of Iowa has that are probably several years down the line for Ottumwa. But operating in a nitrification mode or a non-nitrification mode may have implications on the city's and the plant's ability to remove nutrients. And I think that's something that's part of our next phase of analysis.
Thank you.
But once again, that diffuser makes that big a difference.
That diffuser makes a huge difference. A lot of times, like I'm trying to think of a good example, maybe the city of Des Moines or Ames or other places, you only get a credit for a quarter of the river flow to mix with, because it assumes that plume only gets a quarter of the way out into the river, 500 meters downstream or 300, whatever the mixing zone limit is. Because you have the diffuser, you get the full credit of the full flow of the entire Des Moines River for that analysis.
Any other questions, comments?
Okay, I'll keep going here. I got some conclusion.
Yeah.
Real quick here. Keep going. Okay, so now, if you remember, the loading to the VLR, based on our analysis, with nitrification was about 5,000 pounds. Without nitrification, it was about 18,600. And so that's at that point there, downstream of the primary clarifiers. The primary clarifiers still removed 31% of the BOD coming to the plant. And so we have to back into what the plant capacity is. There's also some solids implications. Like I said, you are going to create and grow a lot more solids without nitrification than you would with. It's not quite that much. I think that 2,400 number is more like 3,000. But you digest those solids too in the aerobic digesters, and with nitrification, you will get much digestion, and without nitrification, you get a tremendous amount of digestion. So the ultimate difference in land application solids is probably a 2-to-1 difference, or 2.5 times difference than what you're seeing today. These are digester capacities. Basically, the bottom line is, if we were to fully realize the VLR capacity, we would be short digestion capacity. And so we can't give the plant the full credit of the analysis we just did, because we don't have the digesters to be able to handle the solids that are generated. And so we had to back off the 18.6 to something just a little less than that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Oh, keep going. So no, back one more. Sorry. So the digestion capacity is just a little bit less than what you would see at the full rated capacity of the VLR. And so instead of 18.6, we derated it to 17,000 pounds per day. It's still a substantial increase over the 11,600 that you see. And we could add some additional digester capacity to bump that up and realize the full 18.6. But that's a cost decision that the city would have to make at some point. Okay, so here's where we back up into a plant loading. So before, we were just looking at what was going to the VLR. Then we have the primary clarifier removals. Those get 30% BOD removal, and so everything gets bumped 30%. And so the plant capacity without nitrification is 7,400, and that's lower than the current rated capacity. And so that may be a little bit surprising, but really the current rated capacity wasn't based on nitrification. It was based on without and some older DNR standards. Without nitrification, we're saying it's 24,300, so over double what the current plant or the current rating of the plant is. And that's obviously a great benefit.
Current is 11.6.
Versus 11.6, yeah. Okay. So 24.3 versus 11.6, but with nitrification, it's 7.4. So that's a 3-to-1 difference between with nitrification and without. Go ahead. So here's the summary. You'll see the maximum month capacity to the VLR system. That's the activated sludge capacity. We added some total suspended solids numbers here to these, so it gives you a little bit more context. But basically that 7.4 and the 24.3 are the without nitrification. If you added some additional clarifier capacity, you could increase with nitrification to almost what you're rated at, but that would be a capital cost of $3 to $4 million. You could realize that capacity by just changing mode of operation and not adding any facilities. Like I said, we were solids digestion limited with the no nitrification mode, and if you relieve that bottleneck, then it would go back up to the 18.6 and the 26,600 pounds. So that kind of completes where we ended off this first phase of the facility planning. We kind of knew that there would be some additional capacity available. We didn't know how much. The next phases of the facility planning study really look at what do you want to do with that additional capacity? Do you want to attract a new industry? Do you want to plan for residential growth only? Do you want to allocate it for future nutrient removal? Or there's the eco-engineers feasibility study of doing a co-digestion project. And those are things that we will look at in the next phase. But our next steps are, we want to complete the plan. We need to look at the impacts of future nutrient limits. We got those potential co-digestion modifications. What do we do with the realized capacity? We need to finalize, a recommended list of projects in CIP for the plant as part of that facility plan. And then we need to decide how, do we want to complete the formal re-rating process with the DNR? Do we want to formally change that 11,600 to the 24,300 or whatever we can negotiate with them? That will require some additional requirements from the DNR and anti-degradation alternatives analysis. And really the question is timing. When does the city want to go through with that? We've suggested that the facility, that the plant staff try this alternative mode of operation to get, familiarity with it. It hasn't ever been operated this way in the 20 years that it's been there. And so there's some learning curve associated with operating it in a different mode like this, and what are the implications on sludge production and so forth. And then we want to develop an operations manual for staff guidance. They have not been operating the plant like this since its construction, so they would probably need some enhanced guidance on how to handle different flow and loading scenarios that they might encounter moving forward, and we can help them do that and give them that guidance.
Before we go on, could I ask
Sure.
two things? It's been a long time. It's been several years now since we've seen a low river. But
Right.
I'm curious, because past history, we would have some times in the winter when you could actually walk across the river. So one question is, on an average, is the flow of that river going to affect the usefulness of that diffuser and not having the nitrification? Then the second question, Cam, at your facility, when we separate the solids and we actually have to sell that to somebody that land applies or whatever?
We don't sell, we pay to get rid of it.
Pay to get rid of it. So when we in fact increase more solids, and then you have your winter time when it can't be, isn't there a period of time when it can't be?
Not in Iowa at this time.
Okay.
Hopefully we don't fly on roads or smoke over ground. We'll have to, especially if we blow the pipes.
Okay, that's what it was for. So I'm just curious about those two components. If we change,
Sure.
how do you address that if in fact you have a lower river flow?
I'll address the lower river flow thing first. I think there's a lot of data out there that supports that minimum flows in Iowa rivers is going up in general. Like you said, you haven't seen an extreme low flow in a while. The mixing zone and the dilution factors and that toxicity analysis that the DNR performs is all based on it's a minimum flow. It's called a 7Q10. It's the minimum weekly average over a 10-year period of record. And so as we get more data and as it gets wetter and less, less low flows, those numbers will continue to go up, but those higher values of river flow only benefit the mixing and reduce even more the requirement for ammonia removal. So the fact that you're seeing higher flows in the river benefit the treatment plant by eliminating the requirement even more for nitrification.
And then a follow-up to that. So with Red Rock doing the turbine,
Mhm.
those, that should even the flow eventually, shouldn't it? I mean, don't they have to release a certain amount? But
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not sure.
all right,
I don't think that will impact the amount of flow in the river. That's probably more, well, Red Rock is upstream of you. Yeah, so they will, that'll even it out, and you probably see a higher base flow than what just like what you said.
thank you.
Will there be any staffing implications if we did this? Will we need more staff, less staff? Will it stay the same?
So to do the normal liquid treatment and normal operations of the plant, I would say no. But to land apply the sludge and the land application of the additional solids that gets generated, there will be a cost associated with that. I think there's a contract hauler or there's a contractor that does that. So it's not an immediate impact to city staff, but there might be an increase to that contract to apply more sludge on an annual basis.
Thank you.
Good question.
I had a quick question here, going back to if we decided, say at some point, to do away with the nitrification process, and that would increase some capacity. Say, for instance, we got lucky and we had to use that capacity for, say, an industry or put some back for future residential development. What would happen if we used enough capacity up to where if the state come back and said, well, we're mandating now to remove ammonia, would we have the ability to put that back? Because it would slow everything down again, and our capacity would have to be much less for the time to get that done.
So the requirement to nitrify is really dictated by the water quality requirement and the toxicity issue. You can, if we can justify the re-rating of the plant, unless something happens to water quality requirements that are significant, we wouldn't see an ammonia limit coming back into your permit anytime soon. What you do need to watch for is total nitrogen and total phosphorus limits, which some plants are starting to see in their permit limits in Iowa. And that is something that gets not harder to do, but we do it differently without nitrification. And so that's a second phase of analysis that we need to kind of look at.
Not getting too far into the second part, because I know that's where you're going to head. With the future nitrate issues we got, and you said we may have to keep in mind some of those preventative measures in the future. Do those preventative measures, if we did decide to do some of those, take up capacity? Would that further reduce the capacity if we were required to start treating nitrates and that type of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good questions. Well, I just want to compliment our staff too on, we just had the Iowa Water and Environmental Association meeting here, and there were a lot of great discussions at those meetings about the pros and cons and what's going to happen. Nobody's got a crystal ball yet, but what the state will do if there's any changes, and what'll happen at the federal level either. So
that's exactly right. I mean, we don't see a whole lot of immediate change at the federal level to require additional ammonia removal or anything like that. And DNR has, they do have their nutrient removal requirements out there, but they're years away for Ottumwa. You don't even have the study phase in your permit yet. That will be the next permit that you get. You'll be required to study it, but you won't be required to build or operate that way for many years after that.
What kind of lead time when you talk about that? Was that like a 3 to 5, 7, 10 year?
Yeah, it's negotiable. I mean, you really study how well the plant removes nutrients today, then you come up with the capital costs of what it would take to do it to meet their goals, and then you talk about a construction schedule and compliance schedule after that. And so there's a lot of factors go into that. The city's spending a lot on CSO removal and, separating sewers and doing a lot of things with the wet weather program. What we've seen is, and you've done disinfection. If you've made progress in other areas, they may not push you as hard on nutrients initially.
Brian, Mr. Mayor, if I may just ask a question. Brian, I know we talked about this earlier, and obviously the merits and the cost savings if we extricate ourselves from a denitrification and operate that in BOD mode. One of the items that we talked about this afternoon, and if you can add a little bit more sustenance to this, and that again relates to the cost, because if the city's going to undertake a different and new process, obviously there are costs associated with it, and you have to look at what the delta is going to be. It seems to me when you look at nitrification, it's almost like we're undertaking something that not only is not required, but we're incurring more expense. So as an example, if Public Works dictated that from this point now in the future, any parking lots that are going to be put in would have to be permeable pavement. Now that's going to help stormwater remediation. It's not going to move the needle though, pretty much at all. But in addition to that, you incur a much larger expense, which I realize with this it's a smaller window in terms of that exposure. But based on your presentation and the emails that staff has exchanged with you, one of the downsides, perhaps, I guess, and correct me if I'm mistaken, is you have additional activated sludge.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has to be transported and that has to be deposited. I think Councilman Dalby referred to that. And then the calculations certainly have to take place, and that is whether or not the cost of in switching to the BOD level, when you significantly reduce your nitrification cost, that process is costing us a great deal of money. And we're not getting any credit for it, which is, kind of difficult to figure out. But it would seem to me, and you can please fill in if there's more, would one of the major cost differentials that the city would experience in switching from nitrification to BOD, would it be that sludge disposal and then the transportation and perhaps the rent costs that water pollution control? If I'm missing something, please confirm or deny.
Yeah, I would say that that's the major increase in cost to switch from the current mode to just a BOD only mode or without nitrification. But there's also a decrease in plant operational costs due to less power.
Exactly
Energy
right.
costs.
Energy costs will go
costs
down
will go.
significantly per pound of BOD. I mean, yes. So if you looked at the near term and the plant was being loaded at what we see today, and you operated it with and without nitrification, you would see sludge production go up 4 times, and you would see power costs go down by half or something like that. And we would have to do we'd have to put pen to paper to figure out, which one ends up winning. But usually power costs are a larger percentage of the plant operational costs than sludge disposal.
You also, Tom, I'm going to interrupt. You also spent a little bit of time talking about, this was the meeting the staff meeting we had before the meeting with council, but you spent a little bit of time, and if you could add a little bit more of sustenance, if you will. And that's the transition. This isn't a, flip of the switch and everything is high tides and green grass, but you certainly go, if you look at the difference being rated, 11,006, and then based on the emails you sent back and forth, it could be as high as the capacity. Rating capacity are obviously 2 different items. It could, you have 20,800 up as high as 28,000. Again, a fairly significant increase. I think one is nearly 80%. But again, if you could spend a little bit of time talking about, from a staff perspective anyway, I can't speak for Cam and Larry. I like the idea that your suggestion was, this is something that if it's all right with council, we quite frankly move into this a little bit slower. And one of them was, you said, was fall, winter time frame, obviously when the water temperature is a little bit less. Put that in perspective if you would.
Okay, so you have to think of the bugs in the system as a living organism, right? And they don't like drastic changes to their environment. And so you don't want to just go and try to cut their age from 12 days down to 2.5 days overnight. You'll throw them into kind of an unstable mode, and you'll get a lot of foaming, and you'll get a lot of upset bugs. So you have to transition to that over time. And kind of think through how you do that pretty carefully so that you don't impact effluent quality, you don't have an effluent violation. And so when we talked about developing operational procedures for the plant, that was the one thing that we were really thinking about, is how do you potentially transition from one mode to the next? How do you bring basins online when you see periods of wet weather? How do you do that, and how do you teach staff and get some familiarity with that? We think that piloting it at some point is good. It's harder to not do nitrification in the summer because everything's warmer and the bugs grow faster when it's warmer, so it's hard to keep them young when they're growing so fast. And so we'd like to see it as the temperatures start to diminish in the fall, to start reducing the age of the bugs from 12 to 2.5 and see how much sludge increases and how much aeration and power costs decrease, and just verify our assumptions and give Cam and the staff some familiarity with operating in a different mode.
I was thinking about that when you made the comment earlier. I would encourage the council and our guests in the audience, put your hands together as you would normally do it and see which thumb is on top. Just do that now. That's what you're used to doing for the last 20 years. Now take and put the opposite thumb on top. Feels awkward as heck. And it's very uncomfortable, but you can train your brain to do that. My point being, if you're going to change operation, whether it's again, gradually move into it or with a new operations manual, it's going to take some deliberate effort to make that change.
Yep. Yeah, and I met with the plant staff earlier this afternoon and walked them through kind of, how might we go about that? They seem open to the idea, but obviously, it's blazing new territory for them. There is a comfort level of knowing what you're dealing with, and day in and day out, it's always the same. And tomorrow it may be different. So we will get the plant to operate in a stable mode. It will just be a different stable mode than what it's currently been operated in the last 20 years.
Okay, very good.
Great job with this. Thanks for putting this together. And it makes sense to me. It didn't at first, but I think it's new territory clearly. But, I'm speaking on my behalf, but I think on behalf of all the councilmen up here in a budget conscious landscape, back to Andy's questions, how long would it take to maybe come up with some sort of projection about the net savings or what it would cost for more removal versus plant operations? Because I think those types of figures would be really important to have in front of us before we would be able to move forward and consider making any decision about this.
Sure. Cam has provided us power costs, and so kilowatt hour charges. We can figure out the difference in the power costs for each mode. We'll probably try to get some. They may have to do some dewatering for some sludge storage during winter conditions. There might be some polymer costs associated with that, which they've done in the past, but they haven't done recently. So it would take us a couple weeks to kind of nail down those chemical costs and dosages and figure out, what exactly that cost might be for the additional sludge disposal.
Brian, just to pick up on Councilman Streby's question, and that obviously a very good one, and that's identifying the costs that we're incurring right now. The rating process, and I don't want to get down in the weeds, that you would know this probably better than anyone in this room. But again, being rated right now at 11,006 pounds BOD, and then matriculating to 24 to 28,000, that rating process. And again, it's somewhat of a slow walk. How long does that process take, the rating process, to change?
Okay, so we just went through this. We went halfway through it for another plant, Denison, Iowa, who had a big industrial contributor, a meat packer as well. And so they were trying to realize unrecognized capacity in their treatment plant so they could allocate it to the industry, because they were getting notice of violations from the state of Iowa for over allocating their capacity. And so what the DNR would prefer is that you go through what you're currently doing and start with a facility planning process, do a capacity assessment, and then come up with, they don't like to just recognize capacity for nothing. They'd probably like to see you make some sort of change or construction project that they can approve at the facility. It could be something small, something affordable. That's typically what we see, but we can talk to the permit writers, the section, engineering section, and figure out what want. And then there's that anti-degradation analysis. And then we could potentially go through that process about the same time that Cam is getting his draft permit for the new facility, and we could work through that negotiation on that draft permit. So the timing is working out okay.
And if council agrees to that, that's certainly something staff would work on. The other one would be, and this goes to Councilman Dalby, a point that he raised, I guess was about a year ago, and that was a plant that was quote unquote a wet industry. And I'm not sure there's a specific way to compute that. I guess that may be a variation of a theme, but again, we'll split this in the middle and say that then our rated capacity goes from 11.6 to 24.3. And again, I want to put you on the spot, but I know when we were talking earlier, there's a point where you said it's perhaps even the point of no return, where you create enough capacity that you're quite frankly exceeding than what you need to have in terms of capacity to suit a wet industry. So I say all that to say this: you wouldn't want to make the same mistake with this that we've done in the past, however many 10 years treating ammonia, which apparently you don't have to do. Is there a sweet spot or a number? Is it 20? Is it 28 that you can accommodate in wet industry?
It really is pretty wide ranging as the type of industry that you would attract and the level of pretreatment that you would require. For this other facility that we were working in, their raw discharge is 30,000 pounds per day. That's a big pork processing plant, but they go through, some levels of pretreatment, anaerobic lagoons, and they can get that down to 3,500. So even a big plant isn't going to consume the additional capacity that, we could potentially recognize, unless you told them that they didn't, they don't need to pretreat. Then you'd be bumping into all sorts of limits. But really, those anaerobic lagoons are pretty beneficial from a variety of different perspectives. Right. And so we would highly recommend that some sort of
my last comment on that, and I just asked council to put this in perspective, though, and that is if we're talking about this, quite frankly, transition right now, it seems to me you're talking about a much, much lower expense to transition to this, where we get away from nitrification and we switch it to BOD, as opposed to undertaking a physical plant expansion like some cities have done, and the return is sometimes non-existent.
Yeah, you guys you'd be recognizing capacity that's already there just through, meeting the minimum of your permit, not exceeding it as you have for the past 20 years.
Thank you, Mayor.
I got one more.
Sure, go ahead.
And thank you for clearing it. This is almost the best possible case scenario where we can, possibly, if everything goes right, if we're early in this process, expand capacity or not have to add a bunch of capital to the plant, especially when we don't have anybody at this immediate time wanting to take up that capacity. But the question I have is, if we decide and we do realize some extra capacity, is there, do cities or do different firms or whatever give a recommendation to cities of what they should keep in reserve in case, like we talked about, nutrient regulations come down? Is there a guide like, you've got this much free, but you need to reserve this much for certain future things that may or may not happen, just to be on the safe side?
Yeah, that's kind of a case-by-case basis on what you're trying to attract. But the rule of thumb is you want to have 10% of your total plant capacity in a reserve that you just kind of set aside, so that you can allocate something initially without having to do a construction project in a short period of time. That's just a industrial allocation kind of rule of thumb. It's there's no hard and fast recommendations. There are plants that build in a lot of extra industrial reserve, hoping to attract the industry, and sometimes it doesn't happen. But a lot of times we see that 10% just held over just in case.
Great question.
Rainy day fund.
Yeah. Well, I think Bob or Mark.
Just one quick follow-up question you had mentioned that Denniston is going through this right now. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we were going through the rating process for a long time, and then we figured out the industry asked for even more capacity than when we were going to be able to re-rate the plant at. So with that turned into a construction project to expand plant capacity. But we were headed down that path of re-rating the plant to unlock unrecognized capacity by the DNR.
So have there been communities or facilities that you've worked with that have went through this process, and have there been any implications both from the environmental and legal aspects of that that you've seen to this point?
Not to the magnitude of Ottumwa. I mean, I haven't seen any, I haven't personally gone from 11,600 pounds to 24,000 pounds in rated capacity. I'm not sure what sort of hurdles we will encounter by the DNR or from environmental groups. You know, I think you should get credit for the great job of removing ammonia that you've done for the 20 years that you didn't really have to do. I mean, there is a benefit to having a higher water quality. And it should be something that you should be given credit for. But I don't know. Now that you start discharging ammonia, even though it's not toxic, even though there's no measurable environmental impact, somebody may decide that, you know, hey, you're going in the wrong direction when it comes to the environment. I have no idea what we might encounter.
Okay. Any other questions? Great discussion, and you've got a packet to take home with you tonight and kind of peruse and go through, and I think that'll help to reinforce some of the things we've talked about. I think we're not taking any action tonight, but I just wanted to get a sense from the council that we're headed in the right direction, and I think we want to encourage our staff under Andy's leadership to continue this process so we keep moving forward. I mean, is there a sense that we're okay with that? We're in the right direction. We're not making any decision about construction or changing anything, but this was a really good presentation. I think it really answered a lot of questions that individual council had, and it also gives us a pretty independent perspective, which we really needed, so. Okay.
Glad to do it. Thank you for the
Thank you,
opportunity.
Brian. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to having more reports from you later on.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Is there any other business that needs to come before the council? Anybody in the audience that wants to address the council? Okay. Then I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Thank you, Vic. Is there a second? Thank you, Matt. Take the roll.
Councilmember Rowe?
Yes.
Councilmember Stevens?
Yes.
Councilmember Streety?
Yes.
Councilmember Dalby?
Yes.
Councilmember Myers?
Yes. I have 6:39.
Thank you.
Mayor, I think this is really good. I think it's moving in the right direction, but I would really love to see more projections.